9 hours. That is the amount of time it took 2 tons of British explosive, packed and primed by 70 Royal Marine Commandos who had come ashore from an American destroyer in darkness to destroy a section of railway tunnel on the northeast coast of North Korea. A section of track that 7 consecutive airstrikes over 3 weeks had failed to permanently close. The North Koreans had kept repairing the bombing damage within days of each attack. Engineers would fill the craters, replace the sleepers, relay the rails. They had the manpower and the desperation to do it every single time, and the supply line would breathe again within a week. The British did not bomb it. They descended into the tunnel itself, placed the charges against the structure, cooked food in a nearby shack while waiting for a second train to pass, shot the guards quietly, and detonated. The tunnel did not reopen. You cannot fill a tunnel with shovels and determination the way you can patch a length of exposed rail line. The crater principle does not apply when the damage is internal and structural, and the entire bore of the thing has been collapsed from within. 9 hours after those men had left their ship, the supply line was gone, and they were paddling back through the surf with their rucksacks and their wet boots, and one man's body, the first Royal Marine killed in Korea, wrapped and carried because no one from 41 Independent Commando left their dead behind. That was the 1st of October, 1950. It was the opening note of a story that would, within 60 days, end with a British lieutenant colonel commanding a 900-man composite force of British, American, and South Korean troops through a burning mountain valley in temperatures so far below zero that rifle bolts froze, morphine ampules had to be held in armpit warmth before injection, and men whose wounds had stopped bleeding because the blood had simply turned solid, in the cold kept moving because the alternative was lying down in the road and letting the Chinese finish what the temperature had started. They called that valley Hellfire Valley. The men who named it were those who survived it. A fair number did not. This is the story of 41 Independent Commando Royal Marines in Korea. It is the story of how a unit that was assembled in 6 weeks, flown to Japan in civilian clothes on commercial aircraft, and handed American weapons they had never trained with before, became one of the most decorated British formations of the entire Korean War. It is the story of what a small group of men with very specific training and absolutely no interest in conventional warfare can accomplish when placed inside the largest and most destructive conflict the world had seen since 1945. And it is the story of a moment in the frozen dark inside the perimeter of a besieged town that should not have been holdable when the Americans who had fought beside the British long enough to know what they were watching asked one Royal Marine why he was going back into the fighting he had barely survived reaching, and received an answer that said everything the history books have said since in far fewer words. But the story does not start in the frozen mountains. It starts where all stories about Korea must start, in the last days of June 1950, when the world that had spent 5 years recovering from the most catastrophic war in human history was told it had to do it all again. On the 25th of June 1950, the Korean People's Army, equipped and trained by the Soviets, launched an invasion of South Korea. The United Nations Security Council denounced the attack and called on member nations to provide military assistance. The North Korean assault was not a cautious border probe. It was a full military offensive with armored formations, artillery preparation, and the strategic intent to complete the conquest of the entire peninsula before the Americans could organize a response capable of stopping it. Seoul was captured by the Korean People's Army on the 28th of June, and by early August, South Korea and its allies were nearly defeated, holding on to only the Pusan perimeter in the peninsula's southeast. For weeks the position looked desperate. The Pusan perimeter was exactly what the name suggested, a shrinking box of defended territory in the far southeastern corner of the peninsula, with the sea at its back and a reorganizing, reinforcing North Korean army pressing every other side. On the 27th of June, President Harry Truman ordered American air and sea forces to aid South Korea. Ground forces followed almost immediately, scraped from garrison units in Japan that were under strength, undertrained, and being fed into a battle they were not equipped to win. The 24th Infantry Division was partially destroyed in those first catastrophic weeks. The North Korean People's Army used its armored spearheads and double envelopment tactics to cut off and destroy American formations that had been in occupation duty for 5 years and had never expected to fight. Then MacArthur changed the war with a single stroke. In September 1950, American and South Korean forces conducted an amphibious landing at the port of Incheon, near the South Korean capital of Seoul. A daring operation planned and executed by General Douglas MacArthur, the landing suddenly reversed the tide of the war, forcing the North Korean Army to retreat in disorder up the Korean peninsula. On the 15th of September, UN forces landed at Incheon, cutting off Korean People's Army troops and supply lines. The North Korean formations that had been pressing against the Pusan perimeter suddenly found their logistics severed, and UN forces advancing on them from 2 directions simultaneously. The army that had been on the verge of total victory disintegrated inside days. Tens of thousands were captured. The rest ran. It was into this rapidly changing situation, the momentum suddenly swinging wildly in the UN's favor, that 41 Independent Commando arrived. On the 16th of August, 1950, 219 Royal Marine Volunteers were assembled at Royal Marines Bickley, then the Commando School. They were commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Douglas B. Drysdale, DSO, MBE, an experienced World War II Commando veteran who was the chief instructor at the Royal Marines Officer School. Drysdale was the right man in every way that mattered. He had the kind of commando background that meant he understood both the potential and the limitations of small unit rating. He had done it in the Second World War. He had taught others how to do it. He was not a man who needed to be told that the objectives assigned to his unit were dangerous, and he was not a man who was interested in finding reasons they could not be done. The distinction between knowing a thing is dangerous and concluding it cannot therefore be attempted is a distinction the Royal Marines have always drawn with precision, and Drysdale was an embodiment of that institutional culture. The commandos traveled to Japan in civilian clothes, with most of the civilian clothing issued by the Admiralty. The unit received more volunteers en route from 3 Commando Brigade involved in the Malayan emergency. They were assembled from across the British military with a speed that reflected the urgency of the request, and they arrived in Japan to find a war already 2 months old and still accelerating. Arriving in Japan on the 15th of September 1950, the commandos were issued American winter uniforms and weapons, but retained their green berets, battle dress, and boots. The green berets mattered. They were not just a uniform distinction. In the months that followed, on frozen roads and in burning valleys, those berets would serve as a visual signal that something different was operating beside the American Marines, something that had been doing this particular kind of fighting, the close-in, behind-the-lines, blow-it-and-leave variety, for years before either Korea or the people they were fighting alongside had ever heard of it. The first indication that 41 Commando was not a conventional infantry formation came before they had even formally deployed as a complete unit. Within 4 days of their arrival in Japan, a detachment of the Commando, consisting of 1 officer and 14 other ranks, left to take part in an operation in the Incheon area. They left Japan on the 10th of September with a Special Operations Company of the U.S. Army and took part in a beach reconnaissance on the night of the 12th to the 13th of September south of Incheon. On the 18th of September, the detachment landed at Incheon with the American Special Operations Company and subsequently took part in several successful operations in the Seoul area. This detachment, landing with the Americans as the Incheon assault was still unfolding, was conducting the very kind of operation the Commando had been assembled for. Not the frontal assault work, not the hill grinding and road blocking, and perimeter defense that the conventional infantry were doing in appalling conditions. The Commando was there to penetrate, destroy, and withdraw. To hit the things that air power could not reliably destroy, and that conventional ground forces could not reach without bringing an entire division with them. The first full unit operation demonstrated exactly what that meant in practice. On the evening of October the 1st, 1950, the submarine USS Perch surfaced 4 miles off the east coast of North Korea. A veteran of World War II combat against Japan, the warship had been converted into a troop transport and in place of torpedo tubes carried troops, 67 members of Britain's 41 Independent Commando, Royal Marines. Led by Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Drysdale, the men were among the first members of their service to go into action behind enemy lines in the Korean War. The vessel had been modified for exactly this kind of mission. The commandos busied themselves retrieving a 24-foot motorboat dubbed the Skimmer and inflatable rafts from an airtight 36-foot-long cylindrical cargo hangar welded to the submarine's aft deck, a feature that led the Marines to dub the vessel the Pregnant Perch. With the boats in the water, the Skimmer towed the rafts toward the beach, while Perch waited on the surface. The target was the coastal railway between Chongjin and Hungnam, a line that carried supplies south from China. Chongjin was only some 40 miles from the Chinese border. The line was the artery. If you wanted to strangle North Korean logistics on the East Coast, this was where you applied the pressure. Detonated as planned, the explosives destroyed a long section of railway, and the raiders made it back to the Perch in the pre-dawn darkness. They returned with the body of Peter R. Jones, the first Royal Marine casualty of the war, who had been killed during a firefight with North Korean troops. Jones is worth naming. Every action has a cost, and Jones was 41 Commandos' first payment. He died in a firefight in the dark on a beach on the coast of a country most people in Britain could not have located on a map 6 months earlier, doing something so specialized and so deliberate that the operational report read more like a demolition contract than a combat record. His body came home on the boats. The Commandos did not leave him. The first mission of the unit was in October, where the Commandos embarked on 2 American high-speed transports, the USS Horace A. Bass and USS Wontuck, supported by the destroyer USS De Haven, where they executed a series of raids on the North Korean coast near Wonsan to disrupt North Korean transportation facilities. A rail and road tunnel was blown up with 2 tons of explosive and completely blocked. 1 non-commissioned officer was killed during this raid. 2 tons of explosive. That number has texture in it. 2 tons is not a shaped charge left on a rail line by a small party moving fast. 2 tons is a deliberate, methodical demolition operation conducted by men who knew exactly what they were doing and had brought exactly the right tools, carried on their backs across open terrain to a tunnel entrance guarded by men they had to neutralize quietly and quickly before the work began. One individual who was initially skeptical of the British Commandos' proposed contribution was General Douglas MacArthur himself. MacArthur, an Anglophobe, bluntly questioned the utility of the British Marines in raids to Vice Admiral C. Turner Joy, commander of naval forces in the Far East. MacArthur had never been a man who trusted anyone else's judgment over his own, and his view of the British as something less than equal partners in American-led operations was not a secret. Joy did not share MacArthur's prejudices and was a vocal proponent of special operations raids using the Commandos. In a rebuttal, Joy wrote, "The 41 Royal Marine Commando was formed and trained especially to conduct commando raids. Plans are ready for destruction of several key points. Believe they can be executed without serious risk. Submarine crew and commandos are keen to fight." Joy was able to carry the day against the general, which was no small achievement. The success of those early raids settled the argument in the only way that mattered in wartime. The tunnels stayed closed. The supplies did not move. The assessments went up the chain, and they said the British were doing what they had been sent to do, and doing it at a standard that demanded no caveats. But the nature of the war was about to change with a violence that made everything that had come before look like a rehearsal. On the 27th of November 1950, the Chinese force surprised the U.S. X-Corps commanded by Major General Edward Almond in the Chosin Reservoir area. Between the 27th of November and the 13th of December, 30,000 United Nations command troops, later nicknamed the Chosen Few, under the field command of Major General Oliver P. Smith, were encircled and attacked by about 120,000 Chinese troops under the command of Song Shilun, who had been ordered by Mao Zedong to destroy the UN forces. That number deserves to sit still for a moment. 120,000 against 30,000. On terrain that offered no flanks, no cover, no retreat routes that were not also kill zones. In temperatures that would reach -36 degrees Celsius, cold so extreme that the body's own chemistry begins to malfunction, that lubricants freeze in their housings, that radio batteries die and rubber crumbles, and a man who stops moving for too long simply stops. Major General Oliver Smith did not trust the intelligence reports dismissing Chinese intervention. Against General Almond's orders, he deliberately slowed his advance and established supply depots at Hagaruri and Coterie, a decision that would prove crucial in his division's survival. Smith was the kind of general who would rather be right than obedient, and his caution was the reason the division did not simply disintegrate when the Chinese came out of the mountains on the night of the 27th. After conducting various raiding operations up and down the Korean coast, 41 Commando under Lieutenant Colonel Drysdale was shipped via sea transport to the port of Hungnam in North Korea to serve with the U.S. 1st Marine Division as an additional reconnaissance unit. Their mission was to locate and destroy enemy forces on the left flank, ranging as far as 23 miles west of Coterie. It was hoped that the British unit and the Division Reconnaissance Company might flush out Communist troops beyond the reach of routine infantry patrols. The Commando, a small complement of about 200 men, were based a few miles inland at Hamhung, where they remained for several days for fresh supplies, equipment, and cold weather clothing. They had no idea what was coming. Like many others, 41 Independent Commando joined in the "I'll be home for Christmas" euphoria and waited. The entire front felt that way. MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo had been assuring everyone that the war was nearly over, that Chinese intervention was a bluff, that the UN columns advancing towards the Yalu River were walking into a victory parade rather than a trap. But the situation was getting more critical by the day. The Chinese Communist forces were furiously pressing their attack at Hagaruri and Udumni. There was only one Marine infantry battalion at Hagaruri, and it was becoming increasingly more difficult to hold. Reinforcements were an absolute necessity. When 41 Independent Commando finally arrived at Coterie, they were greeted with the news that the road to the north was blocked. Task Force Drysdale was quickly organized to clear the road between Coterie and to reinforce Hagaruri. It was comprised of about 900 men and was made up of 41 Commando. George Company of the U.S. 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, under the command of Carl Sitter, and Baker Company of the 1st Battalion, 31st Infantry U.S. Army, under the command of Charles L. Peckham, which was en route to join Task Force McLean east of the Chosen Reservoir. Drysdale addressed his men before they moved. "Lads," he said, "it will not be a walk in the sun. Semper Fi." It is a remarkable thing to hear a British officer use the United States Marine Corps motto. It speaks to a relationship that had already developed beyond the transactional, beyond mere Allied cooperation, and into something more genuine. These men had been working beside the American Marines long enough to have absorbed something of each other. Drysdale saying Semper Fidelis, always faithful, to his own commandos before a mission they all understood might kill them, was a signal that the bond was real. On the afternoon of the 29th of November, Task Force Drysdale pushed north from Coterie, while under constant attack from the People's Volunteer Army's 60th Division. The task force's harrowing experience later earned the road the nickname Hellfire Valley. The task force made up a convoy about 2 miles long and included 100 vehicles, and 12 tanks. They leapfrogged their way north with little opposition until suddenly the Communist Chinese opened fire from the right front. Fighting back from exposed positions along the road, they soon came to realize that the enemy was in far greater numbers than they had anticipated. There were Chinese in front of them and in back of them as they pushed on slowly around roadblocks and other obstacles. The plan was that 41 Commando would take the first hill to the east of the road. George Company would take the second hill, and Baker Company would remain on the road to parallel the progress of the two units as they secured the high ground. The plan survived first contact for approximately as long as plans usually survive it. 3 hours passed, and they had advanced only 2 miles. 4 hours passed, and still no progress. In desperation, Colonel Drysdale called for reinforcements. Early that afternoon, 8 tanks arrived. It was obvious that the hill-by-hill attack was not working. Consequently, it was decided that they should depend on the tanks and close air support to keep the flanks clear while the task force pushed through on trucks as rapidly as possible. Speed was the only answer now. The column was being picked apart from the ridge lines by an enemy that had set the ambush with care and had numbers the Commando could not match in a conventional firefight. The only option was to drive through, to accept that men would die in the vehicles, to keep the column moving regardless of what was burning around it and what was falling in the road. As the Chinese attacks dragged on, the task force became disorganized, and a destroyed truck in the convoy later split the task force into 2 segments. Although the lead segment fought its way into Hegururi on the night of the 29th of November, the rear segment was destroyed. Ahead of the burning truck, Drysdale, with most of his commandos, 2 platoons of tanks, Company G, and a few members of Company B, managed to move on. Drysdale expected the remainder of the column to close ranks. Behind the fire, in the section of road that would take the name Hellfire Valley into every military history of Korea, they could not. The Chinese concentrated fire on the gap. The column was severed as completely as the rail tunnels the Commandos had been blowing all autumn, and the rear section, Baker Company, and the divisional headquarters troops was surrounded and systematically destroyed. Drysdale was wounded while fighting past a Chinese strongpoint, whereupon the Company G commander led the column the remaining short distance to its destination. About an hour after dark, Drysdale's 400 men entered Hegururi. They were surprised, in view of their own day of fighting, to find the town quiet and the engineers working under floodlights at the airstrip to the southwest. 400 men out of 900. More than half of the task force was dead, captured, or still fighting their way back to Coterie. The price of that road was paid in a single afternoon. Despite suffering 162 dead and missing and 159 wounded, the task force managed to bring in 300 badly needed infantrymen for the defense at Hegururi. 300 infantrymen. That was the arithmetic of it. 300 fighting men who arrived in a perimeter that was holding by will and artillery, and the absolute refusal of Major General Smith to tell his people that what they were doing was impossible. Roughly 100 Royal Marines made it to Hegururi. 60 British Marines had fallen as casualties. But those who reached the town immediately went into action, launching a counterattack to retake East Hill, a crucial location for Hegururi's defenses. This is where the story finds its famous moment. When a U.S. Marine asked one Royal Marine, Gordon Payne, why he was going back into combat, he replied, "I'm not done with them yet." Gordon Payne had just driven through a valley where men were dying in every vehicle in the column. He had just watched the force he came in with lose more than half its strength on a stretch of road 11 miles long. He had arrived at a town that was encircled by a Chinese army 120,000 strong. And when? An American Marine, presumably one who had been holding the perimeter through the same sleepless frozen nights and was asking the question because he genuinely wanted to understand what was happening, asked Payne why he was going back in. Payne did not explain the tactical situation. He did not reference the operational requirement for additional manpower on the East Hill. He said he was not finished. 5 words that communicated an entire philosophy of soldiering in a way that no briefing paper or doctrine manual could replicate. The perimeter at Hagaruri held. It held through nights that made the cold itself into an enemy more patient and more thorough than the Chinese, because the cold attacked every man on both sides equally and without preference, and the UN forces had slightly better clothing, slightly better rations, and slightly more reason to keep moving than the People's Volunteer Army soldiers who were freezing in their positions in cotton uniforms designed for a different season entirely. The Royal Marines were used as a mobile reserve in the base, and the next night, B Troop counterattacked a Chinese breakthrough east of Hagaruri, and the perimeter defense was restored by 0400 hours. 2 Marine regiments fought their way back to base from the mountains, and for the next few days the Commando carried out a number of fighting patrols, including a full Commando reconnaissance. By this time, 41 Commando was at less than 100 in strength, and with tank support made probes to confirm enemy dispositions and recover wounded from a crashed transport plane. On the night of the 6th of December, the Commando formed up with the USMC 5th Regimental Combat Team as a rearguard to the division's withdrawal from the base, south to sea, and to hold the Chinese until the column broke out of the plateau. The breakout from Hagaruri was not a retreat in the sense that the word implies disorganization or panic. General Smith famously said, "Retreat, hell, we're just attacking in a different direction." The 5th and 7th Marines fought south from Udumni to Hagaruri, singing the Marines' hymn as they marched in with their wounded and their dead. It was instead a fighting withdrawal, deliberate and controlled, with the rear covered and the dead recovered and the wounded carried, moving south through the same ground that Hellfire Valley had claimed in the northward direction. The breakout southward from Hagaruri began early on the morning of December the 6th. The 7th Marines was ordered to take the lead, followed by the 5th Marines, with 41 Commando and the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines attached. It was cold and the wind was vicious. The road was jammed with trucks, jeeps, and tanks. Destroyed vehicles and trash were everywhere, and there seemed to be nothing but death all around them. It took 38 hours to travel 11 miles. 38 hours for 11 miles. That pace, slow enough that a man walking at an easy pace on a flat road could cover the same ground in under 3 hours, tells the complete story of the breakout without requiring any elaboration. Every mile of that 11 had to be cleared. Every ridgeline above the road had to be verified or seized. Every vehicle that broke down had to be pushed aside or burned, rather than abandoned intact to the enemy. Poor weather, ambushes, and blown bridges all contributed to the UN forces' slow move toward Hungnam, but they fought their way through all of it. They even assembled a portable bridge dropped by the U.S. Air Force in the Funchalen Pass, leaving the pass on December the 11th, the same night they reached the perimeter around Hungnam. Some 193 ships evacuated all UN personnel and their equipment, along with 14,000 Korean refugees. All told, during the Chosin Reservoir campaign, 41 Commando suffered 93 casualties, including most of the assault engineers, signalmen, and NCOs of the heavy weapons sections. For a unit that had arrived in Korea with just over 200 men, 93 casualties was nearly half. The assault engineers, signalmen, and weapons NCOs were specifically noted because those were the specialists, the people who carried the institutional knowledge of how to do the things that made 41 Commando operationally useful rather than simply another infantry formation. Losing them meant the unit had to be rebuilt almost from its specialist corps. After a period of rest and recuperation, at Ebisu Camp in suburban Tokyo, 41 Commando were sent to HMAS Commonwealth, the Australian naval base at Kure, where they received replacement personnel and equipment. The Commando also undertook additional training, for their combat role in Korea was only just beginning. What followed, beginning in April 1951, was the second phase of 41 Commandos War, and in some respects the most technically impressive phase, conducted with far less drama than Chosin, but with a methodical competence that delivered results the air campaign alone could never have matched. On April 2, 1951, the reconstituted 41 Commando embarked on the dock-landing ship USS Fort Marion and high-speed transport USS Bangor to mount another demolition raid. During the spring of 1951, the independent Commando had re-equipped, and its strength had risen to about 300. They trained for coastal raids once more, as the North Koreans and Chinese once again held the coastlines. Amphibious raids against the west coast were ruled out due to the high rise and fall of the tides, and practically all raiding was made against east coast targets. The April raid was conducted in conditions that tested the limits of what an amphibious operation could accomplish. In the early hours of the 7th of April, landing craft of the underwater demolition team found the fog so thick off the coast between Songjin and Hungnam that no landing could be made before daylight. Therefore, the armored landing vehicles with their 75mm howitzers led in the assault after USS Fort Marion had flooded down to launch them. The naval bombardment began 2 hours before H hour, but fog prevented air support all day, and visibility continued to be 100 yards or less. The landing vehicles crawled out of the water only 5 minutes late, and by 1,000 hours the first demolition charges had been brought in by the assault engineers. Only one 12-man enemy patrol came into the area in the next 6 hours and was easily driven off. The railway line was blown, the crater was over 100 feet long, and mines were laid before the Commando withdrew without casualties, and they cleared the beach by about 1,600 hours. A 100-foot crater in a railway line, laid under fog cover with naval bombardment running interference, and the assault engineers working methodically while the rifle sections held the perimeter. No casualties. Clean extraction. The operational signature of a unit that had been doing exactly this work repeatedly and in varying conditions for the better part of a year. From April to December 1951, the unit carried out a number of the lesser-known but successful independent raids along the northeastern coast, which resulted in the diversion of considerable enemy forces from the main battle area. That last part is the strategic point that the casualty figures and the demolished tunnels do not fully capture. Every North Korean soldier guarding a coastal railway junction, every anti-aircraft battery repositioned to cover a potential Commando landing, every patrol added to the coastal watch because the British had already shown they could land anywhere and destroy anything they reached, was a soldier not deployed against the main line of resistance where the conventional battle was being fought. The next major target for 41 Commando was Yeoudo, an island in Wonsan Harbor, some 60 miles behind enemy lines. Secured in early July and established as a forward base from which to mount further raids, the island was initially garrisoned by South Korean Marines. Through that autumn, the Commandos established forward bases on the neighboring islands of Modo, Taido, and Hwangto-do, from which several raids were mounted. During one August 30th raid against enemy artillery batteries on Ho-do-Pando Island, B Troop lost 2 Marines in a clash with enemy soldiers, and 5 other members of the Commando were captured when their landing craft ran aground on nearby Kalmagak. The 5 captured men represent the persistent and unforgiving risk that every amphibious raiding operation carries. The margin between success and catastrophe in small boat operations on enemy coasts at night is always thin, and the margin between a disciplined withdrawal and a situation where landing craft and tide and enemy response converge into disaster is thinner still. The men captured at Kalmagak joined a small number of 41 Commando prisoners of war who would wait out the remainder of the year conflict in North Korean captivity. The Commando would ultimately have 31 Marines killed and 17 captured, with 1 Royal Marine defecting to North Korea, who returned to the United Kingdom in 1960. 1 Marine defected. That fact sits alongside the rest of the record in the way that uncomfortable facts must. The defector's identity has never been officially confirmed, and the circumstances are obscure. He came back in 1960, after 7 years in a country that most people alive at that time expected him never to leave. Whatever the full story was, it remained private between him and whatever part of the British state eventually processed his return. BBC journalist and Member of Parliament Thomas Dryburgh had a rare opportunity to accompany 41 Commando on some of its missions. In a report broadcast on December 20th, 1950, he described the unit as having grown remarkably quickly into the mood and outlook characteristic of this special kind of outfit, which one might define as a nonchalant self-sufficiency, a debonair assurance that is never arrogant, a self-mocking toughness. Dryburgh was a man whose instinct for language was sharp, and the phrase nonchalant self-sufficiency is precise. The Commando did not broadcast its confidence. It did not perform toughness for observers. It simply behaved as though the things it was being asked to do were things it knew how to do, because it did know how to do them. And the evidence for that was the demolished tunnels and the railway craters and the 60-mile stretch of North Korean coastline that could not be defended against it at any point of their choosing. The final tally of 41 Commandos' operational record in Korea is given by the 18 amphibious landings they conducted during their 18 months in existence, most targeting enemy rail and road supply routes. 18 landings, each one requiring maritime approach in darkness or pre-dawn, shore reconnaissance, perimeter security, demolition engineering, and clean extraction. Each one operating in isolation behind enemy lines, without immediate air support in most cases, without reinforcement available if the situation deteriorated, dependent entirely on the speed and skill and physical toughness of the men executing it. The recognition of what that record amounted to came from the highest authority available. General O.P. Smith, commanding general of the 1st Marine Division, wrote, "I desire to take this opportunity to acknowledge the high qualities of leadership, heroism, devotion to duty, and self-sacrifice displayed by officers and men of the 41 Independent Commando of the Royal Marines while serving with this division in North Korea. I am familiar with the long and glorious history of the Royal Marines. This history records many outstanding feats of heroism, devotion to duty, and self-sacrifice by units and individuals alike. The performance of the 41 Commandos during the drive from Kotori to Hakururi, during the defense of Hakururi, and during the advance from Hakururi to the south will, in the perspective of history, take equal rank with the past exploits of the Royal Marines." Oliver Smith was not a man given to exaggeration. He was the general who had defied his own corps commander, Edward Almond, to build the supply depots at Hakururi that saved his division. He was the general who had said, "Retreat, hell, we're attacking in a different direction," and meant every word of it, without irony or performance. When he said that the Commandos' performance would take equal rank with the past exploits of the Royal Marines, he was saying, in the precise professional language of a career Marine officer, that he had watched them do extraordinary things in conditions that he himself found extraordinary, and that the standards they had met were the highest standards he knew how to describe. Their hard fighting together with the American Marines and Army led to 41 Independent Commando being awarded the American Presidential Unit Citation that the 1st Marine Division earned. It was not awarded until 1957, 6 years after the fighting. The delay was bureaucratic rather than evaluative. The citation itself, when it came, was unambiguous. The outstanding bravery of this small 300-man unit, which suffered 93 casualties in the operations against overwhelming odds in the Chosin Reservoir area, has become legendary and resulted in the award of the Presidential Unit Citation, in addition to 14 individual U.S. awards and 31 British awards. The Presidential Unit Citation is the highest award the United States military gives to a unit, equivalent to the Distinguished Service Cross for individual soldiers. A British Commando unit receiving it alongside the 1st Marine Division means that the Americans placed the Royal Marines in the same category as their own finest formations for the same period of operations. Not as allies to be appreciated, as equals to be cited. On the 2nd of February 1952, 41 Independent Commando, Royal Marines, formally disbanded. The disbandment was practical rather than ceremonial in its meaning. The Korean War was settling into the static line fighting that would characterize its final 2 years. The grinding positional battles around features with names like the Hook and the Imjin River, where the ground changed by hundreds of yards rather than hundreds of miles, and where the commando rating skills that 41 had developed were less directly applicable than they had been in the fluid, coast-dependent operations of 1950 and 1951. The unit's purpose had been specific to a phase of the war, and when the phase ended, the unit concluded. What did not end was the lesson. The lesson was not that small units of highly trained men can substitute for large conventional forces. They cannot. The lesson was not that special operations can win wars by themselves. They have never done that, and never will. The lesson was something more specific and more useful than either of those propositions. The lesson was what happened on the east coast of North Korea between October 1950 and December 1951, when a unit of around 200 to 300 men conducted operations across 60 miles of enemy coastline that required an entire defense system to counter, tied down resources that would otherwise have reinforced the main line, and destroyed infrastructure that no amount of aerial bombardment had been able to permanently close. The lesson was Task Force Drysdale on the night of the 29th of November, bleeding its way through Hellfire Valley at the cost of more than half its strength to deliver 300 fighters to a perimeter that was holding by fingertips, and those 300 men being enough. The lesson was Gordon Payne, wounded and exhausted, and having just survived something that should not have been survivable, turning back toward the enemy because he was not finished, and the American Marine who asked the question, understanding from the answer he received everything there was to understand about what kind of men he had been fighting beside. There is a quality that the best small unit fighters in any army develop through the combination of deliberate selection, rigorous training, and the particular kind of confidence that comes from actually doing the thing over and over until it becomes something your body knows, rather than something your mind decides. It is not fearlessness. Fearlessness is a liability in the field, a gap in the threat assessment that gets people killed. It is something more like calibrated acceptance, an accurate understanding of what the risk is, what the task demands, and whether the gap between those two things is one that training and will, and the men beside you, can close. Drysdale had it. His commandos had it. The American Marines who fought beside them at Chosin recognized it immediately. The way professionals always recognize the same quality in each other across whatever boundary of uniform or nationality happens to be in place, because the quality itself has no nationality. It is simply what soldiers who have been made into something more than soldiers look like when the conditions become severe enough that the performance can no longer be faked. The railway tunnels stayed closed. The craters held. The perimeter at Hagaruri held. Drysdale drove through Hellfire Valley and came out the other side, wounded, with fewer than half his men, and immediately began preparations for the next morning's fighting. And Gordon Payne went back into the Chosen Reservoir because he was not done with them yet. 31 dead, 17 captured, 93 casualties at Chosin alone, 18 landings, 1 presidential unit citation that took 6 years to be formally bestowed. A unit that was assembled in 6 weeks, sent to war in civilian clothing, given someone else's weapons, and produced a record that the U.S. Marine Corps chose to honor with its highest collective award. That is what 41 Independent Commando did in Korea. Not the biggest force, not the longest campaign, but a record clear enough and a standard high enough that the most powerful Marine Corps in the world looked at it and said, without qualification, that these men were our equal, and that what they did deserves to be remembered alongside the best things men in uniform have ever done. The tunnel at Chongjin stayed closed for the rest of the war. Gordon Payne went back up the hill. Douglas Drysdale drove through the valley. Oliver Smith said it would take equal rank. The Presidential Unit Citation agreed.